Vermont's important initiative, Energy Independent Vermont. I know many of you have seen versions of this presentation, and we keep evolving it and hopefully improving it. So hopefully you'll learn some new things today, even if you've seen a very similar presentation before. I'm Lauren Hurl. I'm the political director with Vermont Conservation Voters. And
Ben Walsh. I run the Climate and Energy Program with VECAN.
Excellent. So why are we here? For me, it's really looking at what are the bold solutions that Vermont can do to tackle global warming. And I just have my two kiddos that center me every day, and what are the really important big ideas that we can be putting out there that are essential. Thank you, David. I don't know if there's another light switch somewhere.
I'll figure it out.
Yeah, Ben, that would be great. Yeah, it's very hard to see.
You're getting better and better all the time with the light going down. You see your faces.
Good. So anyway, we've all got our reasons why you came out today on a Saturday, and they're all very important reasons, like our future generations, our kids, grandkids, and all of that. So who is Energy Independent Vermont? Oh, and before I get going, Representative Mary Sullivan was supposed to be joining us today. She was on the agenda. Unfortunately, she is homesick. So Ben and I will have to cover, but just know that she is on the House Natural Resources and Energy Committee. She's a huge champion of this idea and was really disappointed, so she sends her regards and wishes she could have been here with you all today. But we'll cover the section she was going to talk about. So who is Energy Independent Vermont? We are a growing coalition of groups, including all of the leading environmental groups in the state. We're working with low-income advocates. We've got over 400 businesses signed on in support of this concept. So this is really an exciting initiative that has a lot of support. If you represent any organizations that are not yet signed on, please come find us. We would love to have you an active part of the coalition. So as you all know, there is a lot going on globally on climate change right now. Thank you. So, the talks in Paris that are happening as we speak, trying to negotiate a complicated global compact on climate change. So lots of momentum, and really the tone of the conversation globally has changed significantly, even from a year ago when we launched this campaign. So that is really exciting. We had, the Pope's encyclical, which for a lot of people opened their eyes to a new perspective of thinking about climate change as a moral issue. So lots of things happening, lots of momentum globally. Unfortunately, as we've heard multiple times today, our U.S. Congress and Senate are being run by people like Senator James Inhofe, chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee in the Senate, who last winter brought the snowball in and saying, how can there be global warming if there's snow in D.C. and these kinds of ridiculous statements. So, as they're passing efforts to try to undermine the Clean Power Plan and other administration efforts, we're not seeing leadership coming from Washington, D.C. We also know that the Koch brothers and their allies have pledged, close to $1 billion for the next election. So unfortunately, we're not anticipating any dramatic changes in D.C. that are going to change that dynamic. And that's why for us, it really is up to Vermont to step up and show why these solutions, how they work, how they're going to work in practice, and set the stage for other states to also to join us in doing these important initiatives. Ben?
So you all know probably more than the average group of Vermonters about the energy goals that we have as a state, but because this is a policy that is about getting to those goals, we wanted to start by just grounding us in what those goals are. So obviously we have a goal of getting to 90% renewable energy by 2050. That's a goal that was established in the Comprehensive Energy Plan in 2011. That plan is being rewritten right now. And really what they're doing is adding some interim benchmarks. That 90% goal is being reaffirmed. We also have a goal of getting to 75% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We had an interim goal of a 25% reduction from 1990 levels by 2012. So that's actually a goal that we can say definitively how we did on it. So on renewables, we're at 16% today, give or take, depending on exactly how you count it. So a good start, but as you can see, we've clearly got a long way to go before we get to 90%. And then on the 25% reduction from 1990 levels by 3 years ago, we actually went up and came back down and got basically back to where we started. So that's a hell of a lot better than going up and then going up some more, but it's nowhere near the 25% reduction that we have as a statutory goal. So yes, Vermont is doing a lot of good stuff, but we have a very, very long way to go if we actually want to get to our goals. We like to think of ourselves as leaders in energy policy here in Vermont, and in many ways we are. We have some of the best electric efficiency in the nation, indeed an efficiency Vermont program that's been emulated not just nationwide but worldwide. And just this past year we passed I think in legislative years, earlier this year, we passed Act 56, which you heard a little bit about if you were in the legislative update a few minutes ago. But at the end of the day, what it's about is requiring Vermont utilities to provide renewable electricity to their customers, and that's going to get us about a quarter of the way to that 75% reduction goal. So it's the biggest single step that we've ever taken as a state towards our energy goals, but it still leaves 3/4 of that goal unaccounted for. So clearly we've got a lot more work to do. So the other kind of piece of context that's really important to always keep in mind here is climate change isn't just this abstract thing in the future. It's not just about our kids and grandkids, although it absolutely is about our kids and grandkids. It's actually happening right here, right now. So Tropical Storm Irene cost Vermont over $1 billion. Billion with a B. That's in a state whose economy is in $30 billion total. So this is a massive amount of damage in a state the size of Vermont. And meanwhile, ExxonMobil, just one of many insanely profitable fossil fuel companies, made a combined $85 billion in 2011 and 2012. And a large part of why they're able to make profits like that, you know, Bill McKibben is fond of saying the most profitable industry in the history of money, is because they're allowed to dump their pollution into the atmosphere for free. So how do we hold polluters accountable for the pollution they're putting out? Those fossil fuel companies have had this sweetheart deal where they've been allowed to dump this carbon pollution into the atmosphere at no cost for over a century now. And that needs to end. And that means we need to put a price on carbon pollution. We actually need to have carbon pollution, the cost of carbon pollution, account for the damage that it is doing. And there are a couple of ways that you can put that price. You can have a carbon pollution tax, which is obviously what we're talking about here today, or you can have cap and trade. They fundamentally get to the same basic conclusion. You put a price, you hold fossil fuel companies accountable, you reduce carbon pollution at the end of the day. They're structurally a little bit different. We are big fans of both of them. There are a few particular reasons we think a carbon pollution tax makes more sense for Vermont. It's simpler. It's going through existing tax policy, so it's quite easy to administer at the state level. And for a small state like Vermont, administering cap and trade is just a bit more complex. And a carbon pollution tax is also very transparent. It's very easy to understand for your average Vermonter. We'll talk about British Columbia more in a minute, but for instance in British Columbia, they saw bigger reductions in their carbon pollution than you would expect based on the price that they put out there. And the biggest theory as to why that was is because British Columbians understood what was going on. They understood they were sort of all in this together, and that British Columbia had put this price to reduce carbon pollution. And so they essentially all did a little bit more than they would have if it were just the price of gas going up because fossil fuel companies wanted to make more profit. Just a couple more things, and I'll turn it back over to Lauren. This was from this Tuesday. So President Obama, I've long believed that the most elegant way to drive innovation and to reduce carbon emissions is to put a price on it, on carbon pollution. So this is not some wacky lefty idea that a bunch of liberals in tie-dye thought up in Vermont. This is an idea that is, as you'll hear from Lauren, something that's being done worldwide today, and it's an idea that ironically is actually conservative in its origins. It's about making the free market work to our advantage, about taking the damage that's being caused by carbon pollution, accounting for that in the price of carbon pollution, and then having the market sort out the best ways to reduce carbon pollution. And you can see, and who supports it, this is just a tiny sampling of prominent economists and CEOs and others who support this kind of a policy. It's all the way from the very right of the spectrum, Hank Paulson, former Treasury Secretary under President Bush, the most recent President Bush, or Art Laffer, who's down here at the bottom. He was an economic advisor to President Reagan, very right-wing economist, to Paul Krugman, who's got a Nobel Prize and is one of the more prominent liberal economists in the world. And liberals and conservatives across the spectrum. And then the last thing that I'll say before I turn it back over to Lauren is, this is a concept that is really, the major corporations on our planet understand that this is where we're headed. They understand that climate change needs to be dealt with, and in order to deal with it, you need to put a price on the damage that fossil fuels are causing. And so you see a lot of what you might expect as quite unusual suspects here, ExxonMobil, Dow Chemical. These companies aren't putting, what they're doing is they're saying internally in their decision-making processes, essentially, they have put a price on carbon pollution. When they're deciding what investments to make, for instance, they're assuming that something like this is coming down the pipe. And they're doing that not because they're, hippie, crunchy, lefty corporations. They're doing this because they understand that this is necessary to solve climate change, and that they're betting that the political system in this world will decide to solve climate change.
So a lot of the reason that those companies are being pushed to do that is, if you look at this map, it gives you a snapshot of what is going on globally. So, the Matt Cota from the fossil fuel dealers recently in the media called this, the proposal we have here in Vermont a fairy tale. But meanwhile, you look at what's happening across the globe, and putting a price on carbon pollution is not novel, unique. There are examples going on all over the planet that we can look to, that we can learn from, and figure out how to put a price on carbon here in Vermont that will work. But this is the direction that we are heading, and so we're figuring out how to do it, how to get ahead of the curve, and let Vermont lead on this. So I'll talk a little bit more about some of the examples. So a lot of information here, and all I really wanted to show you was a snapshot of some of the other places that have done this. And if you're going to put a price on carbon, it's a pretty basic concept. You tax something you don't want, the carbon pollution. So you figure out, what exactly is your tax base there, and different countries and subnational, like provinces in Canada, have chosen slightly different tax bases that they'll do. So you've got some that have done all fossil fuels across the board, for the most part, like British Columbia. You've done some that have focused on households, light industry, transportation. The proposal here in Vermont, it's looking at transportation and heating fuels, but leaving the electricity sector alone because we have been doing a lot of work in that sector. The next thing you have to decide is, what is the rate you're going to charge for that carbon pollution? And so the column over here, you can see that there's quite a range that different countries and provinces have chosen to use. And you've got 30s, 23, $2.40. Japan did a really small one, and they're using all of that money to just invest it in climate projects. So there's a lot of different ways you can structure it and figure out where you're going to put your revenue. Some give all of the money back in tax cuts. Some do some investment in things like efficiency and renewable energy. And you can see, we'll talk a little bit more about the proposal that's up here in Vermont, but ours is mostly tax relief, some investments in efficiency and renewable, because that's where you get a huge bang for your buck of the carbon emissions that we really want from this policy. So not getting into the details, but just knowing that there's lots of examples of this out there happening, and we are looking at what is happening elsewhere and figuring out, and basically every country and subnational unit, like the provinces, have figured out what would work for your economy. And so, here in Vermont, we've got a real opportunity to look at, what is the tax base we want to do, what's the right rate for us, and then what do we want to do with the revenue? And so it's those basic questions that we can really figure out of how to do that in a way that is going to benefit the planet and also Vermont's economy, we believe. So British Columbia is often touted as one of the most successful carbon pollution taxes. So I just want to spend a minute kind of describing what has happened there. It's also kind of the closest to home. So there, one of the things that has been really touted as an important part of their success is, as Ben mentioned, it's a very clean, simple policy and very transparent. They applied it to all fossil fuels with few exemptions. They ended up coming in and doing some agricultural fuel exemptions later on. But it's overall just pretty standard, easy to understand. It was phased in small increments. So it started out at a $10 per ton, which again is like 9 cents on a gallon of gas. And it went up to $30 a ton. Right now they're revisiting increasing that. So it was something that's levied upstream, so on fossil fuel distributors, which is the same approach we're looking at here in Vermont. That's really easy to administer for the state. Theirs is a revenue neutral tax reform, and that has allowed them to ultimately have the lowest income and corporate taxes of any province in Canada, and it's resulted in $1 billion worth of tax cuts for businesses and families in British Columbia. They also specifically did provisions to shield low-income earners, and that's another thing you'll hear about in our proposal, something we're very cognizant of and committed to as well. And they ended up doing also a rural rebate, so people that necessarily have to drive a lot more. So we're looking at that kind of input as we craft one that will work for Vermont. So what's happened? This was enacted in 2008, and by all accounts, this has been a huge success. The chart on top here, you can see the carbon emissions of British Columbia, or this is sales of petroleum fuels, but they're all correlated. British Columbia going down while the rest of Canada was actually increasing. Meanwhile, how did this affect their economy? The kind of bottom line over here is, British Columbia's economy was doing slightly better than the rest of Canada's at the same time as this policy was enacted. So some of this kind of fear-mongering that we're hearing in the media right now of you're going to devastate the economy, or we have to choose between climate action and a healthy, thriving economy is just not true. Meanwhile, they've seen some of the issues that we hear raised about how is this going to affect low-income folks. The income effects have turned out to be progressive. You can structure it in the way to do that. Public support has actually increased over time. After it was initially passed, there was an Axe the Tax campaign. But the people who passed it got reelected, and they did go back to modify a couple things. So I think it's important to remember also that it's hard to get a policy like this perfect. It's something that you can tweak if you figure out some part of it needs to be fixed. In this case, they did the rural and agricultural issues. They went back and made some changes to their policy. So just worth noting that. So of course, those of us in the room like to think of ourselves as leaders on all of this, but we are certainly not alone in exploring this idea, even within the U.S. Carbon pricing was one of the strategies that states can use to meet their commitments under the Clean Power Plan. So it'll be interesting to see in the coming years as those plans are developed if any states kind of see that as an easier and cleaner way to meet their targets. And meanwhile, Washington, Oregon, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island have active campaigns underway doing very similar legislation to what we're talking about here in Vermont. So this is not something happening in isolation, and we are working to connect and collaborate with some of these other states so we can all be learning from each other.
What's with California?
I put a star in California because they have a cap and trade program already up and running, so they got a different color. We're already going. So Ben?
So the goals that we as a coalition have, and I think you would hear this very much echoed by legislators who are considering this policy, and I imagine most of you One, substantially reduce Vermont's carbon pollution, actually get us on track to meet those energy goals that we were talking about. Two, create jobs and grow Vermont's economy. And three, do that in a way that actually ensures that low-income Vermonters can be part of this transition away from a high fossil fuel economy and save money at the same time. So one of the first things that we did when we started looking at this policy, which again obviously is accepted worldwide as the thing you need to do on carbon pollution, is do some research and to actually understand what the effects would be here in Vermont. Obviously, we're interested in advocating for a policy that's going to be good for the climate, but is also going to be good for our state. And so what we did is we contracted with an organization called Regional Economic Models, Inc. They've been around for several decades. They do economic modeling at the state level. That is their exclusive job. And they work in virtually every state in this country. They are also, it's worth noting, the economic modeling firm that the number crunchers in the legislature or in various state agencies use when they're analyzing the potential impacts of policies on the state's economy. And so if this policy was ever going to be seriously considered in Vermont, REMI was going to take a look at it, whether we asked them to or not. So we just sort of went straight to the horse's mouth to start with. So what we asked them to model was a carbon pollution tax at a few different price points that put most of the money, 90%, back into tax cuts or equivalent rebates, and invest in a small portion, 10%, in energy efficiency and clean energy, in the heating and transportation sectors and a little bit in the electric sector. And what they found was with this model, you saw substantial reductions in carbon pollution, that's the top left, at three different price points, $50 per ton, 100 or 150. And again, in each of these scenarios, these were gradually phased in over 10 to 15 years. So that's a key principle to keep in mind with any carbon pricing idea, is to phase it in over time. So at the highest, about 40% reduction in carbon pollution through 2040. And obviously you'd see those lines keep on going out to 2050. That's just as far out as they model. Total employment goes up and gross state product goes up. We're talking about several thousand additional jobs in the state of Vermont. Now that is somewhat counterintuitive, and especially the fact that a higher carbon pollution tax has a more positive effect on the state's economy. And the basic reason that is we spend a lot of money on fossil fuels here in Vermont, about $2 billion every year. And again, that's out of a state economy that's about $30 billion. So we, thankfully, as you probably know, don't produce any fossil fuels here. We're not blowing up our mountains to dig coal out. We're not fracking in farmers' fields for gas, or drilling in Lake Champlain for oil. And that's fantastic. But it does mean that every dollar we spend on fossil fuels, about 80 cents of that goes directly out of the state's economy. A little bit of it stays in our economy for the people who are delivering your fuel, or the clerks at the gas stations, but the vast majority of it goes straight to Texas or Saudi Arabia or ExxonMobil or whoever. And what that means is a policy that is fundamentally about cutting people's energy bills, which is what this would do, is a policy that's going to keep money in our state. And if people are spending those dollars they're saving on fossil fuels on just about anything else, going to the grocery store, going out to dinner, really any other way of spending money is a more effective way to keep money circulating in our economy than buying fossil fuels. So that's the one big thing that has those positive effects on the economy. The other thing is this would cause a lot of activity in construction and renovation as people weatherize their homes and installed solar panels, and those are jobs that really can't be outsourced. You can't have somebody in China blowing insulation into your attic. It just doesn't work. And so what REMI found was about 500 jobs in the construction sector would be created over the first 10 years or so of this program. So our plan is pretty simple. It's to put a price on carbon pollution, to tax fossil fuel distributors based on the amount of pollution that the fossil fuels they're selling cause, and to use that revenue to cut other taxes and help Vermonters move away from fossil fuels. And so if you take away anything from this entire presentation, this is the slide I want you to remember. We're at a point in this conversation in Vermont where if you're talking to your legislators, or you're talking to your friends and neighbors about this, this is the most important thing message to deliver to them. That this is the idea. We want to tax pollution, we want to reduce taxes on other things. We can have a conversation about what those tax cuts look like, and we want to use a little bit of that money to help people cut their energy bills. And if that's the beginning of the conversation, I think you're going to have a pretty productive discussion. So let me just talk a little bit about the specific legislation, because I'm sure you all have questions about that. I don't want to get too far into the weeds, but I do want to talk about a few key policy decisions that Vermont is going to have to make if we move forward on this. So the legislation that's been introduced is, again, and I can't stress this enough, really, I don't want to say it's the beginning of a conversation. It's not. It was introduced last year, that we're in the middle of this conversation. But it is not ultimately what's going to come out at the end of the other end of the sausage making process. Lauren will talk more about the political landscape in a moment. I'll mention a couple of details of these pieces of legislation, but again, as much as possible, we, and I hope you all, are trying to keep these discussions focused on the principles and why we're doing this. So the three big questions that you have to answer if you want to put a price on carbon pollution. One, what's the price going to be? Is it $100 a ton? Is it $50 a ton? Is it 30 like British Columbia suggested? Is it 141 like Sweden has right now? So there are, reasonable people can disagree on exactly how much damage every ton of carbon pollution is causing to the climate. And so that's a discussion we need to have. What exactly is the right price? How quickly do we want to get there? Do we want to phase it in over 10 years? Do we want to phase it in over, Washington State, for instance, has one that is very gradual and takes, I think, 40 years to get ultimately to $100 a ton. So that's the kind of conversation that we need to have on this point. Two, what taxes do you want to cut? What rebates do you want to have? You could virtually eliminate the sales tax. That's a possibility. You could make big cuts to property taxes or income taxes. You could have a dividend that goes in equal portions to every single living person in the state of Vermont. So again, a key principle is cutting taxes in a big way, but exactly what that looks like is a conversation that your legislators need to have, and you need to have with your legislators. And then the third point is investments in energy efficiency. How much of this do we want to do? Do you think 10% is too low? Should we really be plowing a lot more money into that right away so that we can really move quickly away from fossil fuels? Do you think that it should be revenue neutral? And we should just do what British Columbia did and just do entirely tax cuts? That's another way to go. And then what do we want to invest in? Do we really want to focus on sustainable transportation? Is that the nut that you think we haven't cracked and we won't until we really put more money into it? Do you think we need to double down, triple down on electricity and really build on our success? Or have a mix, like what our coalition is putting forward, of heating, transportation, industrial processes, and electricity to really kind of move the whole economy away from fossil fuels. So these are the three key policy discussions that the legislature needs to have. One point that I want to make here, and this mostly belongs in the tax cuts, a little bit in the investments in energy independence. A key point that we believe of any policy needs to be reducing the impact on low-income Vermonters, and again, ensuring that low-income Vermonters can be part of this transition away from fossil fuels to cleaner and ultimately less expensive energy. And so part of that means additional tax cuts or rebates for low-income Vermonters, and part of it means, and I don't have this up here on the slide, ensuring funding for programs like low-income weatherization that help low-income Vermonters cut their energy bills. Low-income weatherization is a fantastic program that right now has 1, 2, 3-year waiting lists around the state and is underfunded. And that is our top priority.
Committees in the State House earlier this year So any tax bill starts in the House, so our House Natural Resources and Energy and House Ways and Means Committees, both key committees that will be considering this and essential to moving this forward, took testimony. They heard from the economists that did the REMI report and so on. We had businesses testifying, religious leaders, we had low-income advocates, so they were hearing from a range of perspectives and really got the conversation going this year in the State House. The Senate also heard some of that testimony as well, so both chambers were kind of starting to talk about this idea, I would say. And at this point, our goal for the upcoming year is really to keep that conversation moving forward. As Ben said, there are some key policy decisions that need to be made. We think the legislation that's been introduced was put out there with a lot of good research that went into shaping a policy that we believe will meet those goals of reducing our greenhouse gas emissions while also helping our economy and helping our low-income Vermont families. But, figuring out exactly how you tweak that, how you get all of those details right, that's what we need to really move forward and advance this year. It being an election year and where we are in the process, I don't right now feel like we're going to pass it this coming year. If we get to that point where we get a bill that everybody loves, we will certainly advocate for that. But realistically, we need the conversation from all of you to be working with legislators to make sure that this conversation is happening. It's happening in a productive way where we're trying to solve those key questions and we're remembering why we're doing this in the first place. And so that essentially is where we are. But we do want to be doing everything to be setting ourselves up to get this over the finish line, which we believe is absolutely within our reach. 2017, when it's not an election year, is a more likely time. So this is where we really need the engagement of people. I'm sure you all have seen some of the media coverage recently. Lots of positive, supportive op-eds, a lot of our messages getting out there. People are taking this policy seriously, and I think that's part of some of the backlash that we've seen in the media at the same time has come because people are starting to on the fossil fuel industry side in particular, get worried that there's traction here and that they're going to have to actually wrestle with it. So I think even though it's frustrating at times to read some framing and things that are outside of the way we're talking about it, I think it's actually great that the policy is being talked about in a really rabid way because we need to have this dialogue. We need to figure out how to get this right. But we really need our legislators to be hearing from you all, and we need you all to get your friends, neighbors, families to be talking to legislators too, because it's easy to put out something about you're trying to increase gas prices and leave out the rest of the story. And we need legislators to understand that there are hundreds of people here at this conference that get that we need climate action and get that there are realistic solutions that are working elsewhere and that could work for Vermont. So there's a lot of things you can do, and I think talking to your legislators is something I know. How many people have talked to their legislators about this policy already? Great. Talked about something else with your legislators? Okay, so lots of great interaction. Some more people that can do that. So really prioritizing building a relationship with your legislator is something that I can't underscore enough. I mean, these are citizen legislators that rely on their constituents and the people in the State House. They don't have staff, so the information that you can provide about just the fact that you care about climate action and climate solutions and want them to be exploring this policy is helpful. Any information as many of you being energy experts and so on, any information that you can provide is incredibly valuable for them. So I strongly encourage you to, understand that you are a resource to your legislator and you can help them understand why people are talking about this policy, why we need it. So doing that, letters to the editor, another great thing. I mean, people seeing in their community that there are, some of their neighbors are supporting this policy. It's incredibly valuable for helping shape the conversation, and those get read by legislators. They get read by all kinds of people. So helping kind of shape that dialogue within your own community, incredibly valuable. And then we've also got our Energy Independent Vermont website, which you can sign on to our petition. Lots of emails, opportunities to engage with, key times to call your legislator. events that are happening all over the state very regularly, so it's a great way to just stay engaged and up to speed with what's happening. So I encourage you to get involved in that way as well if you haven't already. And is Christina gonna?
Yeah, let me just say a quick word here about, so Lauren just talked about the actions that you can take. There's one action in particular that we're hoping you all will take today or tomorrow. So we, as a coalition, have a goal of getting 250 calls into legislators this weekend on this policy. And I think Christina and Laura and Shayna, you raise your hands. So these three are organizers on the Energy Independent Vermont campaign, and they have a couple of things that I'm hoping you will take one and fill out the other. So this is a sheet that very, very briefly, in like a sentence and a half, describes what we just took 45 minutes to describe, and then has a very brief suggestion for what you could say to your legislator on this. The other is a pledge form. We're hoping that everyone here at this conference will fill out this pledge form and say, I'm committing to calling my legislator on this policy. One thing that I really can't emphasize enough on this is what we're asking you to talk to your legislator about, or to leave a voicemail for them about this weekend, is not the gory details of what's on line 3 of page 37 of H412. We're not there yet, and frankly, almost none of your legislators are either. What we would like you to take a quick moment to talk to them about is the idea that we should have a real conversation about putting a price on carbon pollution, cutting taxes, and investing in efficiency. And it really doesn't have to be any longer than the sentence that I just said. Your legislators hearing that from you right now as this conversation heats up, and there's a lot of flack coming from the other side, is absolutely essential to them taking this seriously. I can't stress that enough. So again, our organizers will be handing these out. Please take one, fill this out. It's at you don't need to fill it out right now. We're going to get to Q&A. It's at both of the Energy Independent Vermont tables. We'll also have it later in the program in the ballroom. And we also have sheets on those two tables with your legislators' phone numbers. So jot those down on the back of this, which you can take home with you and make that call when you get home today.
And so Representative Sullivan did know we were going to be doing this little thing, but she was texting with us expressing her regret for not being here today, and she said, please encourage people to not just email reps and senators, but to actually call them at home to express support. I think some of the pushbacks coming from people just preferring to believe this does not have as much support as it does. Wish I was with you. So, just echoing the importance and the value of taking the time to make those calls. So we wanted to leave lots of time for Q&A, which we have, which is great. You come find us if you want our cards or anything for contact info after. But we'll just, as we do Q&A, our future generations, Gabe, Ben's kiddo over there, my little guy, and then Joey's girl, Lila, there. Remember why we're all here. All right, questions?
Would you reiterate the 3 points that you want us to make?
Absolutely. It's put a price on carbon pollution, or put a tax on carbon pollution in Vermont, cut other taxes, and invest in efficiency and clean energy. And frankly, if you don't feel like you understand the policy enough to even really say, do those things, a call that says, please think about doing those things, or have a conversation about doing those things, is also very helpful. So even if you're not quite there yourself, just asking them to take this seriously is also very important.
Barbara?
Obviously the goal is to make Vermont's economy less carbon intensive, and I just wonder how your dialogues are going with farmers, especially small scale farmers. Can we turn the lights on? Often are quite carbon intensive.
Yeah. So one of the things we've been doing is a class at Middlebury College has been doing a research project focused on the agricultural sector, looking at what are the potential impacts, any issues that we might want to proactively address, especially knowing that British Columbia came back and tweaked theirs looking at the agricultural sector. So they are still kind of wrapping up their report, but there's going to be a presentation, I think it's next week, on kind of their findings, and they interviewed a range of farming types, farming sizes, and all of that, trying to get, what are the issues. And I mean, it's, as you know, the agricultural community is so diverse, so, there are farms that we've talked to that have already kind of gotten off carbon and are doing things in really creative, exciting ways. I know that the dairy industry in particular, some of the conventional dairies use a lot of fossil fuels still, many of them, so there is, figuring out how that could work. For example, you can make part of the Energy Independence Fund, is there, investments we can make in helping farms transition off of these fossil fuel intensive strategies. So I think we need to think creatively, and that's one of the dialogues I hope we have this year, and it's an issue that comes up a lot, so figuring out how we help farmers transition off of being fossil fuel intensive industries.
Let me
One
just,
quick follow-up
Follow-up?
question, if that's okay?
Yeah.
Is there any conversation, say, with the agriculture school at UVM on doing designated research on how to help decarbonize agriculture in Vermont?
I've heard that idea floated as something that you could, for example, you could put a sunset in where you exempted farming fossil fuels for 5 years, and meanwhile put some resources to UVM Extension to do that research to figure out how to do that, and then that exemption goes away. So I think there's lots of ways to think about that, but yeah, the idea has been raised. I haven't yet reached out to them, but I think we absolutely should.
no, that's a great idea. One other thing that I just want to say quickly is the starting place for not just agriculture, but for any sector of the economy or a group of people in Vermont is, I think, doing research to understand exactly what the impact would be. So one thing that we haven't done yet but will do, in addition to this preliminary research that's actually just reaching out to farmers directly, is understanding as a sector, how much fossil fuels do farmers end up using. We know it's a lot, but we don't have that specific number. And then the flip side is, how many people do they employ? Because right now, this legislation that's been introduced, and again, you can do this different ways, but it's got a rebate for every single employee any employer in the state has. They get a big chunk of money back. And so understanding exactly that balancing act, because yes, farmers use a lot of fossil fuels, but it's also a big employer in this state. And so there is going to be a lot of money flowing back to the agricultural sector. So understanding kind of the scope of the issue so that we can figure out how to address it is important, and it has not yet been done.
There was research.
Put up the Remy graph.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sure.
There was research in British Columbia looking at what the impacts had been, and interestingly, they found that the agricultural sector had not been any more impacted than any other sector. It was kind of a case of political strength that they had to get that exemption in the end, but there wasn't actually hard data to show that they were more impacted than other sectors. But you certainly could see, we very much value our farms here in Vermont, and so how that conversation will go to be determined. But I do think we need those hard numbers of what are the real impacts and how can we help farms get off fossil fuels, just like every other sector we want to do.
I'm just curious, one of your earlier slides noted that there are essentially two approaches to putting a price on carbon. There's cap and trade or a carbon tax. And if I'm not mistaken, Vermont participates in RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is essentially the cap and trade approach. I'm just curious, if Vermont were to go forward with a carbon tax, would we remain in RGGI, or would we pull out of RGGI so that only the carbon tax applied? I'm just curious how the two would interact.
Yeah.
So our proposal, it would actually exempt the electric sector, essentially on the rationale that, well, there's two things. So one, we are part of RGGI, so we have a price on carbon pollution for electricity already. I don't think it's high enough, but that's another conversation. So we have a price on carbon pollution in the electric sector, and we have a lot of other tools to get at those other sectors. We just passed a renewable portfolio standard. We have Efficiency Vermont's fantastic work. So no, as we see it, it would not impact our participation in RGGI at all. That would continue. We would continue to encourage RGGI to lower its cap so the price goes up. But transportation, heating, and process fuels, industrial fuels, would be covered by this. Electricity would not.
So I got an email, maybe a lot of people did, from Beaufort earlier this week, I think, encouraging me to send a letter to my representative and, you know, please personalize, and so I did. And it ended up being rather long. And I was focusing on the argument that I seem to keep hearing about how Vermont can't go it alone. You know, we're a small state, this needs to be a national thing and all. And so I was saying, I don't see why that's the case. Vermont's been the first in all kinds of things going back through our history, and we take pride in that now. You know, we brag about being the first state, you know, on, you know, any number of issues. And so, so I was saying we should do it. And also that there's other states, you know, Massachusetts is working on this too. I didn't even realize Rhode Island was until today. I heard Rhode Island too, and Washington State and Oregon. You know, it's not like we're the only ones. And if we can do it first. So, and then I was saying, and legislators need to have, you know, stronger spines to stand up to. And so I'm just wondering what your thoughts, whether that's a good approach or whether that's not really the right.
I mean, my sense, we do hear a lot at the legislature that people are kind of fatigued with, why do we always have to go first on everything? There is this sense that we just did GMO labeling, we've done all this stuff, do we really have to go first on this as well? So we've been more going with the, kind of what you see on this slide, of us going it alone is actually going to not only be meeting our commitment to climate action, but also helping our economy, whether or not anyone else does this at all. And it's a side benefit that us doing a successful program like this will be a model that other states can look to and jump on board. So that's kind of a way of talking about it that we're using more often. I think coming from, you know, a constituent saying lead and, you know, I'm here to get your back is great. You know, but just to be aware that there is some of that, like why do we always have to be first?
A couple of quick things on that. So the two responses that I really use the most on that, one is just kind of empathize a little bit and say, you know, of course, I'd love to see a regional approach. I'd love to see a national approach. I'd love to see an international approach. That would be fantastic. Doesn't seem like that's going to happen right now, so we've got the choice of either just saying, well, it'd be better regional, so let's not do anything. Or, well, it'd be better regional, but that's not going to happen, so let's do it ourselves. Like, why wait? So just, you know, kind of feeling their pain a little bit and saying, of course it would be better regional, but barring that, let's do it in the state. And then the second thing is just really getting back to responsibility. That, you know, we've got the option here to do this. Regardless of what's happening in the region or the country, we could do this here, and we have a responsibility to deal with our carbon pollution. And yeah, we're doing a lot of great stuff, but you know, there was a debate 2 days ago in the Ethan Allen Institute, which if you haven't heard of them, you know, I consider yourself lucky. They are a right-wing think tank, essentially the kind of Koch brothers Heritage Institute for Vermont, believe it or not, that exists. And they were making the case that basically, oh, we've done a lot of stuff, like we're done. You know, wash our hands of it, we're green. No, that's ridiculous. We've gotten back to where we started. We haven't really cut our carbon pollution at all. So we have a responsibility to do our part, I think is a message that resonates, I think, a bit more than just simply, we need to lead, damn it, you know, being first is good. Although again, to what Lauren said, that kind of a message is gonna come much better from all of you than it is from either of us. So feel free to deliver that if that makes sense to you.
I'm just wondering why I'm feeling so uncomfortable. Because you're using all the right words. But it's like a runaway train that's jumped the tracks. Yeah, let's hold polluters accountable. By all means, let's do that. Let's put a price on it. It hasn't been defined. Is it carbon? Yeah, okay, it's carbon. So how do you stop fossil fuels? Isn't the idea to get to 90% renewable? Yes. So why not stop fossil fuels? You don't do that by taxing users of fossil fuels. You tax the originator, the manufacturer, the distributor of that. You prevent the oil or whatever to come into the country. You prevent it from being taken out of the ground. And if you stop that, then you'll finance renewable energy. The business plan isn't doing any of that. It's taxing the user. All of us in the room, the farmers, the parents of school kids and like that, by putting $1 tax on gas? Come on, that's not taxing the manufacturer, that's not taxing the importer at all. And then where's the money going to be used for? 90% to cut taxes, including those on business, and 10% to go to renewable energy? I mean, this plan just doesn't add up at all. And you're getting people to go run signing petitions to support a plan that you haven't even described here. And to talk to their legislators about it?
Yeah, let me respond to that, because
I'm distressed by that.
I actually, the first, let's say 2/3 of what you said, I couldn't agree with more. In an ideal world, absolutely, we would have, well, ideally international, but let's set that aside because that's a whole other ball of wax. But ideally, you would have a national policy where you would tax every mine shaft, every fracking field, every wellhead. And you would, and the corporations paying the tax would literally be, you know, BP, who is sucking that oil out of the ground. That would be fantastic. Unfortunately, the guy running the climate committee in the Senate literally wrote a book called The Greatest Hoax, saying climate change doesn't exist. So that isn't going to happen in the near term. Ideally, I mean, frankly, it needs to sooner or later. So where we come into this is saying, if that isn't going to happen soon, and it isn't, then what's the next best thing that we could do here in our state? And so that would be, in our view, taxing fossil fuel distributors, the fossil fuel companies that are bringing fossil fuels into our state, and then selling them to the retailers who are selling them to customers. So you're right, they will pass on all or most of that cost to the end user, just like Exxon would if you taxed at the wellhead. They would also pass that on to a significant degree to the end user. So we're taxing as far upstream as we can in the state, distributors, which I think is the word you used, and then we're using that revenue to cut taxes in a big way, yes, including for businesses and for municipalities and nonprofits and the state government who also have employees and who also use a lot of fossil fuels. And so, and the reason for that is employers in this state, just like all of us, use a lot of fossil fuels right now, and they're going to see that cost passed on to them. So when we looked at variations on this policy, what we were convinced of is getting tax cuts or equivalent rebates back to employers in addition to back to families was an important part of the policy to make it work for Vermont's economy. So that, you know, if you were a, you know, business of 15 people in Randolph and your cost was going up on one side, your cost was going down on another, and you could keep on employing those 15 people. And then the 10% number, I absolutely hear you. I would love to see as much money as possible go into incentives and other programs that help efficiency and clean energy get built. And frankly, reasonable people can disagree about whether 10% is the right number. I've heard very compelling cases made for 20 or more % of the revenue going into that. I've heard people say, well, you should use every dime of it. And if that's what you think, then tell people that. Tell people we should be spending all of the revenue from a carbon pollution tax to help people transition away from fossil fuels. That's the part of this discussion we're in right now, where we're hashing these kinds of details out. So I think we may disagree on whether or not doing this idea at all in Vermont is a good idea, but I think we actually have a lot of common ground on what the ideal scenario is, and that frankly we should be taxing fossil fuel companies, which is what our proposal would do.
And it just, briefly to add, so Representative Sullivan was going to describe in great detail her bill today. So we, to some extent, because we believe that, you know, the conversation, a lot of it is going to change, so we don't really want to get bogged into the weeds of, let's walk through every provision of H412. Let's focus on the concepts that we want to accomplish. But I think in doing that, a lot of what you said is actually exactly how the bill is structured. So happy to talk with you offline in much more detail. We can walk through the bill, but
yeah, let me just throw out 60 seconds of the bill, because I frankly intended to do that, and I sort of did one bit of it and skipped over it. So just at a very high level, because again, this is, you know, we're in the middle of this discussion, so I don't want to pretend that any of these details are set in stone. What the bill would do is put a price on carbon pollution at $10 a ton, or about 9 cents a gallon, that would slowly go up over the course of 10 years. At every year, as the price on carbon pollution phased in, tax cuts would go up at the same time, and the investments in efficiency and clean energy would go up at the same time. And so on the efficiency investment side, that 10%, that would go to low-income weatherization first, at least $8 million every year. And then the rest of it would be spent on sustainable transportation, including public transportation, carpool, infrastructure, getting people into more fuel-efficient vehicles, a lot of, you know, heating efficiency measures like weatherization and cold climate heat pumps, and then a little bit on renewable electricity, in particular the small-scale stuff. On the 90% side, that would fund 4 things. Rebate for every employer in the state of Vermont based on the number of employees they have. We use that instead of a corporate income tax cut because it gets money to municipalities and nonprofits who don't pay taxes, but still employ people and still use fossil fuels. 2, it would do a refundable tax credit for every single Vermont taxpayer, no matter how much money they make. So this would be, if you're a low-income individual, a check back at tax time. Number 3, it would be a low-income rebate. So this is an additional rebate for low-income Vermonters. And then 4, it would cut the sales tax from 6% down to 5%. So that's what H412 does. And again, that is one way you could cut taxes and invest in efficiency. But that's the conversation we're having right now. Richard, you've had your hand up for a while.
So I think there's an undercurrent of mistrust and opposition that the money will actually transfer back into those 4 buckets that you just mentioned. And given history of the legislature, we know that it's tempting when there's a pool of money to dip into. What mechanisms are considered to ensure that refunding actually happens?
So, so one possibility, which I always like throwing out, because yeah, I actually like the idea, but it's also worth noting what other places have done on this. So in British Columbia, they actually had a provision in the law that said if all of the taxes weren't put straight back into tax cuts, then the tax commissioner actually would see their salary cut. So that's one option. In addition to that, I would say, so one, the legislation lays out in no uncertain terms exactly how much money, what percentage goes into this tax cut versus that rebate, and 100% of the money is accounted for when you read the piece of legislation. And that would have to be true for any legislation that we would end up supporting. At the end of the day, though, that skepticism, frankly, I'm sure exists for the sales tax or for the income tax or property tax. We have a state government that's a certain size. We're going to fund it with some sort of a tax or another. The discussion is about what taxes we're going to fund it with, and our proposal is to reform the tax code by cutting taxes on things that we'd like more of, like income, and raising taxes on pollution. So 5 years from now, I see no reason that the Vermont legislature would be more likely to do the kind of money grab thing that people describe for a pollution tax than they would for the taxes we have today. So that, as far as assurances, it's the BC thing and the legislation. And if you don't want your taxes raised, tell the legislature that. Tell them you think it should be revenue neutral.
I think going to British Columbia,
for at least 15 years. If you want to know a political quagmire, is British Columbia. They are the most corrupt government in Canada, and it works there. I mean, they throw governors out like crazy because their system is bad.
I think it's all the
But
message.
they had no trouble at all.
You're absolutely right, Richard. That is,
And they're going it
key.
alone, too.
So, just in terms of the mechanisms, you say that, you know, that these fees would be applied to distributors, and that's distributors operating in the state or located in the state. And if it's distributors operating in the state, but are perhaps residing in New Hampshire, for example, how does that work?
So it would be anyone, so if you're bringing it into the state, then at that point you pay the tax. So New Hampshire-based companies would be paying it on any fuel that they're importing into the
Okay,
state.
so it's kind of a sales tax on them, and I guess it's a sales tax on all distributors, really, is what it is then in some sense.
You can think about it that way, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean, right now, for instance, with the gross receipts tax on heating fuels, a fossil fuel distributor in New Hampshire can legally deliver to Vermont companies, but only if they're paying the gross receipts tax. They're legally not allowed to deliver fuels to Vermont customers without paying that gross receipts tax. And I think it'd be reasonable to include mechanisms in this law to strengthen the enforcement of that kind of thing, but that's the idea.
yeah, sure.
I want everyone here to know something that I find helpful about all this. It has to do with the commons. The fact that there's no price to pay for carbon pollution is just a subset of the whole way we do economics. And let me just give you this example. If you're cutting wood, the cost of cutting wood is the cost of the man's labor and of the gas for his saw and probably something for his truck. It's not for the cost of the trees. The trees are a gift from God, and therefore we don't have to pay for them. This is true throughout all of our economic thinking. And that's why it's so hard to get something like this in place, is because we're crossing a threshold and saying that people should be paying for the things that they're using. So I wanted to add that into the mix.
Thank you.
The word tax, does that need to be, if you so many people hide from looking about this and that word, then I'm wondering how you see use of it, and if it could be avoided with carbon pricing, for example, sounds far less offensive to the average listener. And can you address
They
that?
call it a fee and dividend in Canada.
Yeah.
So a big part of why we ended up, this is a critical discussion, and really the way we talk about it is I can't overstate how important talking about it is, and we are continuing to evolve how we talk about it. So input is great, and your point about how we're talking about it related to trusting government and all that. Tax in particular, we had done focus groups and polling, and one of the lessons that came out of that was that if you try to hide it from people, then that raises hackles that you're kind of trying to pull the wool over people's eyes. And so it was, call it what it is. It's a tax. And I think we need to do a better job of making sure that the other piece of, that tax cuts, tax reform, the tax shift part is getting lost in a lot of the media coverage. And so, but I think, we still come back to, at the end of the day, it's a tax on pollution. And if we try to just call it a different word, then that could breed some mistrust. So that's where we've come from, but we continue to evolve the conversation and love the input of what words you're using that are resonating in conversations you're having with people. So please share that with us.
We've had many discussions about this as a coalition. one thing I would say is I'd echo what Lauren just said as far as this being tax reform. That's a message that, again, similar to the leadership thing that we were talking about with Betsy earlier, I think all of you talking to your legislators about, you know, I think we need to reform the tax system so that we're taxing pollution rather than income or other things. That's a conversation that I think you all should be having, and frankly, we aren't necessarily the best messengers for reforming the tax system as a concept, but that's an idea that we need to get, I think, much more infused into this conversation, that this isn't just a new tax, which is of course what our opponents would like everyone to think. It's reforming the tax system and changing, you know, adding this new tax and cutting other taxes, but reform really is the idea.
I'm curious if there are any other fuel dealers in the room.
Matt didn't show up today.
So, you know, I work at the Energy Co-op of Vermont, and we're one of these companies that feels demonized by this legislation. You know, if there was an organization in Vermont called the Progressive Fuel Dealers Association of Vermont, the co-op where I work would be the founding member, the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. There wouldn't be any others. So even though we deliver over 1 million gallons of fossil fuels every year, we also market solar hot water, we deliver wood pellets, we do energy audits, we install heat pumps. So you would probably think of us as the good guys as far as fuel dealers are concerned. But sitting in an environment like this and listening to these presentations feels very threatening, and some of it frankly misleading. So the slogan you have down there, Vermonters save, polluters pay, it's just not right. You know, Vermonters save, Vermonters pay. That's how it's going to work, because every penny that's added to the price of fossil fuels, wherever it's added, will go straight through to the people who are using the fossil fuels. So it's Vermonters who are going to be paying the tax. I was also at the debate the other night, and I found it pretty disturbing. And part of what was disturbing was the way in which the argument for the legislation was presented, and it seemed totally out of touch with the people who are going to be paying the tax. You know, the truck driver, the school teacher, the guy who's got an excavating business. And somehow, I mean, this is all a little bit jumbled up for me, but I mean, if there was a couple of points. One, in the discussions and in the changes in the legislation, try and figure out how you can, if not get fuel dealers to support it, at least get them not to oppose it, or not oppose it as strongly as they will with the legislation in its present form. So one of the things you and I have talked about a little bit, Ben, is biodiesel and bioheat, seeing if the legislation can address that. And I think the final thing I'd say is just a question really, is, you know, the results from British Columbia were by and large when fossil fuel prices were much higher than they are now. So what evidence is there that a carbon tax is going to have any impact on reducing carbon emissions when, you know, gas is $2 a gallon? And so I'm just curious about whether that's been addressed. Sorry, I went on a long time, but I'm trying to be in favor of this legislation, but it's pretty much impossible.
Well, first of all, thank